Good afternoon. My name is Lalit. I'm just introducing at this point in time Rajeev. So Rajeev Kathpalia is an eminent architect and urban designer. He is a partner in Vastushilp consultant from Ahmedabad, which is also the office. Another partner is our well-known and esteemed Mr. B.V. Doshi, who has also won recently both Padma Bhushan as well as Pritzker Award and also Reba Gold Medal very recently. So Rajeev has graduated from Chandigarh College of Architecture and the last more than 30 years of practice has done wide-ranging projects, institutional projects, townships, heritage, revitalization, and also especially he has also got award for net zero campus designing, which has included many integrative approaches. And he also got the Prime Minister Award for Hyderabad Charminar precinct for that particular. They also have Vastushilp Foundation. Sometimes we confuse between foundation and consultant. So foundation is a part which is a part of charitable trust. He is a trustee and also former director of that, which has been doing a great amount of work both on research, education, as well as supporting many, including the international studio, Habitat Studio is a part of that. Rajeev has been teaching in different institutes within India and abroad, and also a visiting and honorary professor in many colleges in China, as well as there are one or two places. And he has been associated with Auroville for many, many years. They have been coming also to Auroville, and it is for perhaps one more time and opportunity I see that the role they have assumed, they are assuming is also very vital for us. And he, along with his team and with Mr. Doshi's mentorship and guidance, we have a very good opportunity to create a good platform where we can have opportunity to deliberate all the possible inputs, insights, diverse opinions, and come with something synthesizing which Auroville can make use of.
Thank you, Lalit. I'm going to be keeping you between tea and homegrown cities, so you'll have to give me a little time. My journey with Auroville began actually in 1974. Some of you may not know this. I thought I should bring this up to your attention. The first time I came, I was a first-year student in college. I came to Auroville, and it was barren, red land with few structures, few things coming up, very exciting offices, developing things, which I'd never seen that kind of energy and passion. And ever since, well, with the Galaxy plan, you keep going around in circles. So that's what I've been doing, is going around in circles, visiting Auroville, dropping by. Circles sometimes become elliptical, and I've been sort of circulating, around, circumambulating around Auroville. However, I'm going to take you away from Auroville today. I think you've seen a lot of Auroville. You've seen all the issues, the good things, the problems, and there is no end to those. So I'm going to move you away from this to something what I call homegrown cities, because I firmly believe that we have to find our own path. I think that was the message that comes from Sri Aurobindo or from the mother, that we have to find our own path, which is local to us, indigenous to us. I think there are many, many examples we see around the world, and everybody comes and says, I want this and I want that. And I don't think that's the way to go. I think you have to search within and find out. So I'm going to share with you 4 projects. I call them projects, but they're learning experiences along that. Just to give you a sense of how we approach things. And it'll give you some clues to the kinds of concerns that we have, so that when we are collaborating, you know a little bit about me, and I'll get to know a little bit about you as we go along. So with that, I'll start on homegrown cities. And of course, I like to show this because the colors on our trucks and every state represented there, and then of course this overstuffed bundle. So there is a structure and there is this looseness of accommodating things. How do we fit it in becomes an important part of our urbanism. And then of course I look at this. This gentleman was somebody who I met right in front of the gate of our office. And this is many years ago. This is when mobile phones were becoming ubiquitous and people, everybody could almost afford them. And there was a time of the missed call. that they would give you the missed call so that he wasn't charged, but you were charged for that. So this guy's a mason. And there are 5 people on this Bajaj scooter. He says, just about 300 meters down the road, there is a chalk. And I used to stand there every morning to be picked up by a contractor to be hired for the day. And ever since I got the mobile phone, I didn't need to stand there. I would be on call. And then because I got successful as a mason, I got a Bajaj scooter. So now I'm mobile. I can do things. So I'm an empowered guy. I mean, the term, I'm putting words in his mouth, but he said, this has changed. So his helper is behind. His wife is in between. There's one child out here. There's another child in between. And the wife goes to all the construction sites because they have to provide proper water and sanitation so she can wash her clothes. The kids have a creche. Things have moved on from the time that, there was no hope. The other one was that I look at the way that we serve our food, and we have a thali. And we have a thali and we say, okay, everything is there on it. You choose. How do you want to mix it? So the choices are with people. How do they want to mix and match things? And I think that's very, very important. So with that, I come to things which I think are important in our cities. If you see, these are, like traces of any city, whether you take Mumbai, Ahmedabad, Pune, and there is the old city of Ahmedabad, which is a density of 800 persons per hectare, 450 years old now. 1 square kilometer if you take and look at the kind of built mass and the porosity within that built mass. And then you start coming to a place called Judge's Bungalow, closer to in the western part of the city, and it comes down to 250 persons per hectare, and the buildings are 12 stories and 15 stories, yet the density is going down. So I used to always wonder how come in 3 stories you could achieve that density which you can't out here. Yes, it's a little overcrowded. There are spaces, the larger spaces, scale of spaces aren't there. But what's wrong with us? I mean, how come 3 stories and 15 stories don't match? And then you come to Prahlad Nagar, and there's only 180 persons per hectare, and then you have these bungalows and things like that. And so these are questions that have fascinated me of how cities grow, change, add. What is the typologies that you pick up? What is it that happens? And the same with Mumbai or Pune. I'm sure some of you are very familiar with that. The key in all of this is, landscape and soil, and as Julio mentioned very importantly, water. These are issues that are connected to the ground. And those have been shaped over, thousands of years. They're not something that you can change easily. You have to start looking at what's beneath the ground, what's the kind of soil, what sits on top of it, how do you collect surface water, underground aquifers, etc. All of that is fixed in our lifetimes for sure. You look at urban forms and layout and you say, well, that's changeable every 500 years or so. Cities will renew themselves. They will change and grow. And when you come to architecture, well, 50 years, it'll change. 200 years for sure, it'll change. What was 2 stories will become 6 stories or 8 stories, and that will keep changing depending on the land pressures or things, or the city would have moved out from there. And then when you look at technology, like this mobile phone, every 6 months is changing. So it's quite easy to change technology. And today when we talk about smart cities, we talk about, a smart city is all about sensors and things. It never talks about people, or whether the people should be smart or dumb. But it talks about sensors, and sensor technology is changing all the time. So, artificial intelligence is changing all the time. So that's fairly easy to change and adapt. And then you come to behavior. Human behavior, we are very adaptable. We adapt to any situation. That's the easiest thing to change. Our mindsets may not change, but behavior can certainly change. So I think when we start thinking about cities, we really need to start looking at what has to be guaranteed for generations to come. What has to be done for the next couple of 50 years or 100 years. And then come down to what can be easily changed, and as we go along, we'll change those. I'm going to give you 2 examples from the city of Ahmedabad because I live in Ahmedabad. I'm engaged with the city of Ahmedabad. It's one of the fastest growing cities in the world. We have reached in just 10 years from 6.4 to 8.8 million. And by 2031, we're expecting 10.8 million. So, one side that looks very exciting. That's a growing city. But what happens when you come to growth? You have pollution. It's terrible if you look at the pollution. You have flooding. Cities that, earlier didn't flood, now flood. You have issues of parking, you have issues of exclusion, and then, most importantly, living quality. So that's basically what one starts looking at. Now, several years ago, one of my thesis students did a thesis on, we have a mechanism called the town planning scheme, or land pooling, as it's commonly called, in Gujarat. It's very successful. As the city grows and more villages come into the fold, people, instead of paying any cash or things for infrastructure, have to surrender their land, 40% of the land. It started with 25, now it's gone to 40%, and 60% of the land is retained with them in their original plot. That 40% is used for infrastructure, roads, hospitals, schools, some for sale, for making money, for paying for all of these things. And that sort of comes about, and it's an accepted mechanism because there's no money exchange. But the value of your land goes up 2 to 3 times immediately. And so everybody now believes in it. And in fact, that's something that we should be talking about the green belt, as we'll come to later, because you own only 30% of the land, 70% is not yours. So maybe that's a thought that needs to go for the green belt. The other part that we looked at was that when all this was happening, so I asked a student of mine that, why don't you look at natural systems? Because every planner thinks there's a white sheet of paper. The land, it has no value, it has no form, it has nothing that runs off water, there are no trees out there. That's the way planning looks at most plans. And we said that actually, if you started reinforcing those and connecting those together, then I think you add value. And that value is, it brings down the cost of infrastructure development, because things that flow by gravity, like stormwater or sewage, etc., that makes eminent sense. If you look at it with public space, because if you have water bodies, well, that's where you want parks and gardens, and you want to make that as the most public space. So you connect all these things together, and the environment is sustained. So these sort of basic connections don't happen in our planning system for some reason. And though it's a very, very simple thing to do, we said we're going to show it to you, we're going to do it. The student sort of did this stuff. I thought he did really well. And then there was a seminar in the Ahmedabad Urban Development Authority, and the municipal corporation did a seminar about 7-8 years ago. And I showed them this project. And I said, listen, why don't you try this? That time we had a sensible lady who was the municipal commissioner, and she said, oh, that's a great idea. Why don't we try this out? And she said, okay, there is a ring of affordable housing that has been proposed around Ahmedabad. And so as rural areas urbanize, there is affordable housing that is going to come up out here. Why don't you take a chunk of 12 square kilometers out there and work on that? So that's what we did. So the question was, can the existing qualities such as abundance of animals and nature, because these are villages converting, so the villages become the focus of this change. Usually planners look at villages as problems, as aberrations. Let's make a road around it and forget about the village. Now, I think villages are also the first place of urbanization. If you see all urban villages in most cities, that's where migrants come in and find housing out there. That's where they rent housing. And so it gives them an infrastructure which is not affordable by any builder in the city or by any government. And if that doesn't happen, then squatters and slums come up. So this was the kind of anchor that we decided to look at. And new infrastructure and urban functions, and of course, the villages are then seamlessly incorporated in the urban structure. Now, what does increase in quality and lower costs actually mean? The moment you lower these costs, obviously developers say we want to develop this land. So generally it means 20% for roads, stormwater, sewerage, electricity, 5% for open spaces, 15%, and which are never really taken care of, they're just left aside, 15% for amenities, land banks, economically weaker section housing, etc. And what we started looking was not the cost and means, but at the qualities and objectives that we wanted to achieve, which was being able to walk to your local shopping street, being able to go to a park, having nearby access to public transport, having nearby schools and cultural buildings. So this became the basis of looking at how villages were incorporated. So this is Ahmedabad in the center. You can see the light yellow colors, and that is where Ahmedabad is growing. And this ring is an outer ring road, and that dark yellow that you see out there is the 12 square kilometers, which there are about 4 villages in there. So there are 2 adjoining villages, and the city is kind of creeping on this northeast side. Now, when you start looking at this land, you start seeing that the village life centers around the pond. None of these are natural ponds. These are all man-made ponds. For agriculture, you need water. You look at the slopes of the land. You make bunds out there. And as, again, Julio mentioned in the morning, fields, etc., give you clues to how water is percolated in, collected together, and used as a collective effort. And there is also then the public spaces naturally out here. Whereas the village chopal sits out there, the banyan tree and the water body, these are all interconnected. Another thing that you find is this ubiquitous high-tension lines that cut through our landscape. And when you start looking at them, you can't build under there, but you can use them for open spaces and connections. And then you look at irrigation canals, lakes, local water bodies, and these are also part of the landscape. And if you start looking at them as assets rather than as something to be discarded, then I think you save a lot on infrastructure. And so what we started looking at was public land and the structure, the plot structure, the vegetation structure, the road structure, and the water structure as layers which connect together one on top of the other. The moment you put them together, you get a plan. And that starts changing from rural plot structures actually very interestingly, and this is, I'll come to the next project, where we found about 1 hectare to about 1 acre or so is the larger, most rural land holdings. If you look at this and you start looking at the urban block, a sensible urban block, that's about the size of it. Not only that, but I'll show you that the trees that are planted on the embankments then become part of your road structure and the side trees for this. So you can combine all of this, and all of this can be used. The canals can be used. The Narmada main canal that passes by, mandatory open spaces can be under those high tension lines till they disappear. And the reuse of existing routes and roads can be all made together to connect up this new structure that's coming into place rather than as something that is to be added fresh. So that's the this thing, and you can see the yellows, that's all the connections. So ultimately, cities are about connections. They're about connections between your movement and your movement to pleasant spaces, through public spaces, through places where you can gather, from places which are next to water bodies, to trees, etc. Now, this drawing shows you, generally the town planning scheme does that. It has one major arterial road, then very small little things, and then little plots of open spaces dispersed in between, because there's a certain percentage that you have to work with of open space. Instead of that, if you concentrate along the water body and put all your open spaces around that and focus on that, and then use all the plot divisions as they are here to make these roads with the trees, then you've preserved that whole thing, and you've got urban blocks of a certain size and scale that work with the city. And then, as I told you about the relationship, we mapped up all the villages in the surrounding areas and their relationship to water and to the public space in between, which was the critical thing as such. And from what we came to was that 20% that was used for roads, we said 15% is actually roads, even though the total amount of connectivity will increase, the percentage of roads will actually decrease in the land that you use. And your pedestrian network becomes, and your gardens become part of that. So you have linear parks, linear connections, which connect up everything together. And all the other things remain the same. So the municipal authorities said, yes, this is a great idea, because they weren't losing any revenues. And they were actually saving on infrastructure. So that's how this came about. And then that's how the plan emerged. And actually you see that the field layouts are very much like urban blocks. They're not very different from that. And then some sort of visualization of how canals could be reused, public spaces, the streets connecting to them, etc., could be connected together. And the larger open spaces would have the taller buildings, and then the rest would sort of take their time to sort of grow. So you get a definition of a city starting from the public spaces and the streets connecting up, and then slowly the land fills up, because it's not going to happen in 2 years or 5 years, it's going to take 50 years. The other project that I wanted to sort of quickly go over was this stretch, which you see from east to west. If north is up, east to west, there is an 18-kilometer long metro line that is almost complete now in Ahmedabad. In fact, it passes in front of our office. Huge, this thing, infrastructure that's coming up. Now, the question is that we are very good at putting up metro lines, large projects like this. Every city thinks this is the flavor of the season, and they want metro lines. Whether it connects up anything or not is a different matter. Secondly, most importantly, as we discovered, is that even after you do this, the last mile connectivity is the key for any of such project to be a success. And so if you can't walk to the metro line, then I think you lost the game. You'll have this metro running empty, not making any money at all, and slowly they'll say, well, this is not successful. You'll also find that if it takes you more than, say, 400 to 600 meters of walking distance, people won't walk. If they have to take their scooter there and find a parking and then take on the metro, it's not going to work. They'll just drive the 6 kilometers, which they would have gone in the metro. So we said that here's a chance to sort of actually subvert the system to make a pedestrian-friendly city. So Ahmedabad has hardly any sidewalks. And we said, here's a chance to make large sidewalks, allow last mile connectivity, and break through the housing societies that they were. So I'll give you an example. This is just in front, close to our office. And if you see this little stretch out here, out of which 87% of the land is private. The green that you see out there is 13%, which is streets and roads cutting through it. So if you look at all the building plots, etc., that's how the town planning schemes came up. And for whatever reason, large chunks were divided, but nobody thought about connectivity. They said, okay, here's a large parcel, then they'd give it to developers to develop it, and you'd get gated societies. What we found very interesting was that people would break the walls, the compound walls, to take a shortcut. And some of them had started allowing that. So we said, why don't we use that as a method and start looking at margins? We waste about 28 to 34% of our land is locked up in margins in buildings in our cities. And it is completely useless. It's if you start quantifying it in terms of money, I think it's a huge amount. There's recently a report in the Times of India for Ahmedabad. There was a CEPT study done that showed how much land you're wasting in your cities. And that's why I come back to what I showed you in the beginning, which was that the density in the old city is so much higher, still being 3 floors, whereas in the new city, it's all locked up into these margins. And so we started looking at that and the common plots. And we started discovering so many ways that you could take private and public lands, connect them together, and have shortcuts making this. Now you start getting the sense of an urban block within that. And then those places, you start putting in public utilities, public amenities, etc., to connect the city. And from that emerges concentrations of public spaces with large housing, this thing remaining untouched. It will change as it changes. So the whole point was that how do you sort of carve out of what exists and see very carefully what you can install inside that and make it public friendly and more porous and permeable. Now I'll come to a competition that we took part in, which we never won, but there was Richard Rogers, who passed away recently. As one of our competitors, we had Fumiko Maki and us participating in this Amravati, and we put a lot of these ideas that we were talking about into this, and I thought I should share this with you. It was part of a larger master plan of about 276 square kilometers, and we were asked to work on the capital complex of 4 square kilometers within that. That's just about a little short of your city area. This is about 4.9 square kilometers, and this was about 4. And so you see that little strip out there stretching from this major highway coming in here to the Krishna River on the other side. The Krishna River floods, so there's a huge bund. So actually you have no access to the river. It's sort of, there's a huge bund that cuts it off. So the challenge was, how do you connect to the river, not allow the flooding? in fact, you have another problem from the hills. The water flows in towards the center and then comes out, and you have to discharge that water. So there were conflicts in the ways that topography worked. And that's the Krishna River on top. You can see how large it is. And so we looked at three things: the sacred, the land, the people. The sacred, I think it's important to anchor people to where they belong. The land, I think it tells you about how the topography, the soils, the species of things that grow on it, and the species that thrive on it. It's mostly agricultural land. And then, of course, people and their culture. So we looked at these three things, and we said, how do we represent that in a plan? And so the sacred was that if you look at this stretch of land, and you said you had a diagram like a Kundalini diagram showing the 7 chakras, dividing up the spaces. And each of these formed a Vastu zone, because this is Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, and Vastu is very important. So it was part of the brief. We'll come to the question of whether how much do I believe in that, etc., later on. But we did this zoning, and we had a Vastu person as part of our team to do this. And from that, the idea was that the principal buildings, there were 3 principal buildings: the Secretariat, the Assembly, and the High Court, which forms the entire complex. And then there was housing in between, and there were government offices. This was essentially a government sector as such. And those would stretch in between. And then a carpet of cultural buildings were interspersed in between this that connect these 2 principal anchors as such. And these were various kinds of museums, art galleries, etc., that came up. So this was the sacred part. Then there was, of course, all these existing bunds, and then there were sight lines, and there were connections through that, there were canals through that, and we said, how do we incorporate that? And we started connecting that, existing trees, plantation on site. I know it's not very clear, but bear with me. And then these public spaces that we interspersed were connected through various sight lines and shortcuts through them. So they made a crisscross pattern of connections. And around those, anchored around that, was the dense clusters of built form that surrounded each one. And then they were made more porous, and so to get the kind of numbers that we were looking at to fit into this. And so that was the usage of the land. The third part of the people was 6 clusters of, there were 2 villages adjoining us, 6 clusters of local schools and facilities, which were again where these cultural buildings were happening. So they were clustered around that so that they would be useful, not only during certain specific hours, but they could be used 24/7 by other facilities also. Residential programs so that each one had easy walking access within 5 minutes to any of these facilities. Office programs facing the central open spaces, which are mostly government offices, and then a system of interlinking bazaar streets that tied up this whole thing. And then, of course, inside public bus loop interlinked with the bazaars, the streets, and the public nodes, as well as water-based movement through that, etc. And so this is what really formed the basis of the plan. And that's how the plan sort of emerged, that connecting to the Krishna River, the main public spaces, the main things for the assembly and the secretariat on one side, and the high court on the other side, and the office spaces and housing areas connected in between. Now, what were our concerns when we were looking at this? And that was, one was health and safety, movement efficiency. I mean, we all know that people walking is the most efficient form of non-polluting transport. Cycles, public transport, and last and least is cars. Similarly, a fatality rate of accidents, and we are sort of one of the highest in the world now in terms of fatalities of accidents. You go above 30 kilometers, it's still 10%, and after that, it just zooms up. 50 kilometers, your speeds increase. So when we talk about 15 to 25 kilometers, that makes so much sense. And of course, pollution, because the moment you take away this traffic, well, pollution levels start coming down. And the other one was mixed use. So how do you reduce walking distances? How do you make inclusive societies? and flexible infill and engaging a program. And so if you see the standards for each of these, whether they're cultural buildings, is the red one, standards for walkability. And what we achieved in Amravati was far more efficient in terms of walkability, that they were much closer, densely packed. And so the build form came something like this, that through your bazaar street, which is this part of it, offices, cultural buildings, dense housing, and then slowly to more private bungalows, etc. As you went to the periphery, the bungalows came in. So public nodes and culture, as I mentioned, cluster of local amenities along with that, 5 minutes walking distance, public plazas connecting them, bazaar streets connecting it, and then, of course, future expansion within that, etc. Walkable cities meant confining cars, active street life, defined streets and urban spaces, generous sidewalks, limiting building heights, and pleasant microclimate. These were the criteria that we put up. The question of thinking about density, very often that's the model one in the center. If you took a look at FSI2, you need that much parking and you get a tower, and you get this sort of island around the thing of cars. If you look at setbacks, then you're still covered with cars. And what we were looking at is mixed use and parking all happening underground. Now, we are not talking about a completely car-free city, but we try to confine cars to a certain area. And I'll show you in this thing. And then the kind of densities you achieve compared to, say, Hong Kong or Hyderabad or Washington, I mean, these are figures that you looked at urban blocks. What is the size of walkable distances? And we are all aware that finally everything has to be scaled to human walking distances. Because I think the moment you exceed that, then you say, I need something to go drive in, something to carry me through. So I'll just sort of quickly go through this. This is the housing and the rest of it. And that shows you what sort of came about as a model. And then, of course, there was the landscape. So we had to take care of water as retention ponds. So instead of doing one retention pond, there's a series of connected water networks that take you through, and that also becomes a mobility corridor for slow-moving boats to go through it. We also get reflective pools, peripheral canals, and then the central greens to linear connections, and then finally to village buffers and agriculture. And we looked at productive agriculture as part of the plan, not something that you have only trees and forests. You also have productive agriculture as part of the entire plan. And from that came also the private greens. And so you get a very large percentage of green in the thing. And then the different types of roads, connections through bazaars and basement parking for the streets, so that they're limited to this bazaar street and the rest of the parking actually goes underground. And of course, not only cycle tracks along the streets, but also within the green spaces. And then there's the citywide network of MRTS, the metro rail, as well as the bus transport, and a loop bus that went around this, 4 kilometers length. Okay, these are figures I don't think you need to worry about. Then the question of energy, and the energy thing was we were looking at localized infrastructure. So we looked at a certain population threshold of about 20 to 25,000 people in each cluster, and saying that, okay, what is the energy needs? How can you treat for water? Connected through this air conditioning, as well as providing electricity at a local level by using the waste that is being generated by the town, as well as borrowing all the rural things that come in to use that as gasifiers to run the electricity grid. So instead of having thermal power, we were saying natural gas and solar PV was the way to go, eventually. And these were connected to also water reduction. So how do you collect rainwater, low flow? And I have calculations for all of this. And I think these are common things, but to put them into one project and do that is, I think, the important part. Same with waste, solid waste. And then cooling as such. So what kinds of turbines, etc., we could combine. These are all worked out with this. and a water balance of how much rainfall, rainwater harvesting from different surfaces that we do, different levels of treatment for each one of that connected to this, and reuse, of course, of your wastewater, as you mentioned in the morning again, using that connected to it as a complete grid. And this sort of gives you a comparison of what the Amravati Capital Precinct, which is this part of it, compares to the central vista that's being done in Delhi and the Washington Mall and Paris, the Champs-Élysées, and of course the Jaipur Old City, if you look at that, just as a comparison of densities, open spaces, a comparison of them. And so these are some images which I think just give you a sense of the city. And so parks, gardens within the city with the built form connected to it, sort of flowing into each other, not isolated little pockets, but flowing together. I think the important part that I'm trying to make is that. And even when you talk about administration, you talk about places of protest and revolt in between them so that there is space for everybody and every opinion. And finally, I end up with this beautiful miniature which Mr. Doshi did, connected to this. And this actually was in a temple. So that Kundalini diagram didn't just come out of nowhere. It actually came from somewhere. I'll come to the last thing is Nalanda University, which we are in the process of completing, which is about 455 acres. But there, actually, we are implementing all of this. As we talk, all of this is actually happening. So whether it's water or it is to do with energy, all of these, I'm saying, can be done. And at scales which are fairly large, which can be upscaled easily. This, I'm sure you're all familiar with. If not, actually, you visited this place. And this was the inspiration for the kind of architecture that sort of manifested itself. But I don't think it's about the architecture. It's about the fact that ruins allow you this latitude to imagine any possibility. And each one has their own way of looking at ruins. And so everybody finds their own little way of connecting to what is there. So when we started, we had this strange piece of land which goes, and I'll show that to you a little clearly afterwards. And the other one was this area gets a lot of rainfall, and it is absolutely flatland, it floods. And the general way, if you look at traditional villages, you excavate the earth, make a pond to collect the waters for the rest of the year, and mount that so that you're protected from floods. And so you get this diagram of how do you build. And then, of course, that water is not only useful for you, but it also has fish in it. It has other kinds of things that are produced out there, and it becomes a part of your life cycle and culture. So this is the land, and you can see there is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 villages that sort of surrounded this piece of land of 455 acres. 2 places the water collects. There is a huge watershed. There's hills on this side, the Rajgir Hills, very famous. The Buddha came and meditated out there, so did Mahavir. So for both the religions, it's a very, very important sacred place. And so you can see the Rajgir Hills in the distance, which make the backdrop from where we enter. And those local water bodies, this is in the summers. This is not after the monsoons, in the summers. So we said that's a symbol of what could happen out here. And then rainfall, runoff generated, soil percolation, evaporation, building roof runoff, paved area runoff. You know, the old city of Ahmedabad has a collection of tanks under each house where the roof water is, collected every season. It used to be used regularly, now less so because there is water on tap, but earlier they depended on that. And so they had to maintain it because it was your water that you were going to be collecting. You had to maintain that roof. Before the monsoon, you cleaned it up. Not only that, but then the streets, because the water would first go into the tanks, which were emptied by that time, and it would take a while for those tanks to fill up. So you never had any floods on the streets because you were not releasing that water immediately on the streets. And then the streets were, if you see, are those winding, these things, those are actual water courses or water channels. So therefore, that's why they meandered around and went. And so these were lessons that we said, how do we do that? So all our roof water is being collected in separate tanks and being treated. Water runoffs from the plazas and the This thing is collected separately, and it's actually if you look at the ahar and pine system in Bihar, how they do agriculture, it's very similar in some ways. So we take ancient wisdom, put it together in contemporary ways, and from that started emerging a plan of how this place could be the focus of this and the water bodies and the connection. And slowly it came to, like our ancient temple tanks, etc. There is a tank in the center, the things move around it, and the water levels change over seasons. They're collected together, and important public buildings happen around it. And so in 455 acres, we said a 10-minute walking distance from the center to the side is what we should aim for. So how compact can you make it? How dense can you make it? And so that's how the walkability part came. Then was the water network. So what we finally did was to stop rainwater, flooding. We have these holding tanks in two parts and large agricultural holdings which can get flooded in a severe storm. But they also give us the resiliency that when there is a drought, we have excess water. And we use that water to go into the main tank, and that's the water then we consume. So that people are aware that this symbolic tank is also something that you have to take care of, otherwise you will be polluting your own tank. So that became the focus of the university. And then, of course, you say if there are waterways, then you should have pedestrian networks, and you have green networks around that. And eventually, of course, you need also motorized transport, so you have battery-operated golf cart-like buses. All parking happens on the periphery. You have to come and change. You don't drive in your cars. In the beginning, right now when they've started occupying, obviously they say everything is not in place, so the faculty is going to bring their cars inside. We said, okay, we'll make temporary parking, but eventually they will have to also park on the periphery and move out. So you go in stages as densities grow and things change. You keep changing with the times, but you make provisions for that in the beginning. And then that's how the plan appeared. And that's the hills and the plan, and that's a comparison between Venice at the same scale, Jaipur of the main central part of it, the Forbidden City in Beijing, and this is the Sarkej Rosa tank out there, and these are our tanks, so it's about 2 times that. And then the distances we looked at was 500 meters to 400 meters is the thing. So ancient Nalanda ruins and the sort of cloisters that were there, or the viharas as they're called, and the pathways, all of them in different parts relate to that. And then most importantly was this, that what you excavate, you build out of that. So we are building, I think, one of the largest constructions of almost 2 crore bricks or compressed earth block that's ever being done. It's done mechanically. Both main contractors are actually doing this. The other important thing was that 200 villages used to contribute to the required amount of provisions that used to sustain this ancient Mahavihara. And we said, can we give back? And so when we looked at the cycle of resources and a net zero campus, we said, if we look at this, that you produce power by biomass, so whether it is to do with agriculture, crop residues, sewage, municipal solid waste, animal residues, industrial residues, forestry, crops and residues, you get your energy and water from there. You get some photovoltaics, but that, in the way that we look at cooling, because that consumes 60% of your energy, that if you can use that heat, this thing exchanged between that, then I think it becomes even more productive. And so therefore, instead of talking about high tech, we're talking about cow tech. And that's what we are trying to sort of achieve out here. And I think if that works, then I think we have an alternative source of energy. Bihar is power deficient, so even if you say you exchange with the grid, that's not possible. The other thing, and I think we're running out of time, so I'll run through this. This is the ancient ruins, and you have these serrated edges. And so our ruins of the buildings came from that, a language of buildings that came through service areas which make the periphery, climate towers that bring in cooling into it and collect the water, and then classrooms that mushroom out, and we call them the learning towers. And then the walls are made of service buildings which take up all different kinds of forms. They start from the same structure. And there's an advantage to that. So the outside temperature cools down, this breaks down the thing, and inside you can get about 32 degrees Celsius because it's shaded like a veranda. And so you have to go from 32 to 24, not from 45 to 24. So you save on energy. And that, of course, is symbolic too, because if you look at this is like a stupa, or the Buddha in meditation, as the stupa is actually. And from that comes a series of buildings that emerge out of that. And from the model, we came to actual construction. So the first convocation, the brick we gave actually as a souvenir the brick from the site to the President of India then, and the next president standing next to him. And that's, of course, Professor Amartya Sen, who was the first chancellor. And then construction started. That's what you see is a mixture of burnt brick, which is the red one, and then you see the brown, that is all compressed earth block, taken out from these lakes, which were made. These are all our construction water came out of that. We have no bore wells. We are not boring any water from the ground, from the aquifer below. That sort of shows you the brick-making system. It's automated, tested in all kinds of conditions to make sure that it works. And you know the government is very, very fussy about the way that they look at all of this to approve it. That's the more completed buildings, as some of them are getting completed. The classrooms coming up, and the stupa, as you can see, being formed in the negative. And then other parts of the infrastructure that goes through it. And finally, that's what it looks like with the lakes. There are 4 such large lakes, and there are several on the periphery of it which collect water. And this was something that was put up at the Royal Academy of Art in London. There was an exhibition, and this poster, 2 posters were put up there recently. Showed context, excavation, where we made and the material that you got from that, and you collected water in that. So this sort of forms the basis or the underpinning of it. And then life and learning happens because it's a place of learning, and life sort of evolves around that. Okay, this is all about water. We were asked in 2004 to do a memorial for the earthquake victims of Gujarat's earthquake. This is 2004. I'm still working on completion of the first part because it's been a very difficult project to complete. The basis was simple: plant 1 tree for each victim. When we found out the number of actual victims, there were 13,805 victims. And it was represented for us, the forest represented rebirth, plurality, adaptation, interdependence, evolution, and transformation, and a celebration of life again. Rather than mourn, we said we should celebrate life and the growth of trees. This is the fort, and this now becoming the center of Bhuj. Otherwise, it was the periphery of the city. The city was on the other side. This is how it is for most of the year. Then, when you're lucky, because you get only 300 mm of rain, even if you do get it, within a few hours, divided over 16 days, this is what happens to it. It transforms. And we said that if you bring water, so they said, you'll get a Narmada Canal, let's do the Narmada Canal. We said no. If Dholavira could exist, the Harappan civilization could exist, then I think we should look at this. And the journey of each drop of water started. And that time we didn't have digitized ways of modeling this, so we sort of hand drew every drop of water's journey. And instead of one large reservoir, we had many, 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 many reservoirs collecting where the waters coalesced together. And so, instead of a tank, you had many tanks of different sizes that came and collected water. And so you could do them over time. You could phase them out very easily. They were cost effective. They didn't go over 2 meters ever, normally about 1.5 meters. So they were cheap to do. And we decided to do them out of gabions. So you fill the local boulders into by local labor, and you make these leaking reservoirs. So it collects the water, because otherwise it would just sort of inundate the rock and sort of expose the rock. And we got this. And so that's a celebration of coming collectively. And so that's what it was when it started. That's when the first rains came. And then for some years, it started slowly. You can start seeing downstream of each one, as the water goes in, the plants start taking root. Now, that's what we are looking at. So you can see those reservoirs in between, and you can see how the hill is still barren. It has this weed growing on it, which is very difficult to take out and root out of it. But the rest of it, what is called Gando Bawal, as it's called in Gujarat, or Julius Prosoporis or something, whoever is it? Right? It's a wild, this thing that they got from Australia, and it sort of proliferated and wiped out everything else. And then one part of it is the sun point, and so I end with this picture. Thank you. All right.
Ten minutes for questions.
As architects from Auroville, we are supposed to weave our ideas together and submit it to Vastu Shilpa Foundation. So from your point of view, if you could provide us like a one-line brief or a design objective which makes perfect sense, that would really help us.
So by the end of these 3 days, I'm sure we'll have more than one line. So let's look for that.
or
I'm searching as much as you are, because I think I'm learning. I don't claim to know enough about the place. And I think it's very kind of you to sort of share whatever you have learned over the years from here with us. And so hopefully by the end, we'll be able to walk together.
Could you comment a bit about implementation and how you might see implementation in the Auroville context versus perhaps a campus?
When you say implementation of which part, what detail, etc. So I think it's a much more complex question to be taken up as we go along. But yes, definitely that is going to be the key. And I think what we are aiming for here, all these exercises, is to move towards implementation rather than to just talk about things. I think that's a given time frame within which we would like to do this. And so I think we all have to fall in step and move towards that.
No, I have a small question. It's about the project in front of your office. So you showed that. How did you manage to carve out those? They were all
open
private spaces, right?
Right. So there are what you call common plots, right? There are margins. So this is entirely out of common plots and margins. And then there are some government lands locked in also. Ownership is by the government. Then there are some institutions which have larger land holdings than they're actually using, which could be borrowed from them, because they're also getting some benefits. So you start, I'll tell you what, when I worked on the Charminar precinct in Hyderabad, it was a real challenge because firstly, that time Chandra Babu Naidu was the chief minister, and he engaged us. When it came to actually implementing anything, he said, this is not my constituency, go talk to the AIM, MIM. And so, this gentleman who comes quite often on TV nowadays, he was the person I had to deal with. Okay. The thing that happened was that we discovered, because we walked around every square inch of that space, we understood every nook and cranny that was there. We understood how many schools were there. We found that shop owners had a say in things. We found that schools which were using their playgrounds for a certain amount of time would be willing to time share it with the city to open it up as public spaces for a certain time, as long as they were maintained. So you started making connections. And it's the same way as what I'm talking about, these housing societies. Of course, this thing out there is that now in a 100-meter stretch from from the metro rail, they're saying you can get up to FSI 4. So from 1.8, they can go to 4. So that's a big carrot. But to go there, you will end up with these towers. Now, the question is that also all homeowners, etc., in societies are not going to agree. So we said there is a mechanism that, okay, you can't go to 4, but if you have a house there or a plot in a housing society, can you go up more than what you are, because needs change over time. And that itself will allow changes. So it doesn't go to 4, but it goes to, say, 2.4 or 2.5. And that itself will bring in change. So, but when you do that reconstitution, you start getting chunks of land which are locked in.
So the trick is to really engage a lot of detail. So how much time does it take for this kind of stuff?
Oh,
and how many people do you engage in that?
A lot. I mean, this goes over at least a 6 to 8 month period. So, because there are so many stakeholders, and you go through the government mechanism of how do you deal with stakeholders, etc. When do you have meeting? And then informally also, you know people, you know builders, you know house owners, you know this thing. So you also informally engage with them. That's how you get information to start saying that what is possible.
But 6 to 8 months is okay compared to our timeline.
It's interesting just the timeline you said. And the fact that you have to deal with government agencies. I think, my personal opinion, I'm very much interested in the process. We have to somehow heal a deep wound, which is a structural problem in Auroville, which is lack of institutional memory. It's very common that whatever project which is spanning over a certain amount of time falls on somebody's hands first, but then there is a turnover of people in the administration office or whatever, and somehow the memory is lost. And then again, you have to start again reinventing the wheel. Do you think that this Dreamweavers and your help in this can also touch this subject? Thank you.
Yes, certainly. I'm hoping to. I mean, that's why I am standing in front of you, and I really feel that it's a great opportunity that David and Omar have initiated this Dreamweaving. When I saw their first presentation, which David made some time ago when I'd come last time, I thought it was a great opportunity to engage with the people and collaborate in a meaningful way, because finally ownership has to be local. It cannot be by people who parachute in from outside and then claim to know everything. You don't. And so it's always the case that I think you have to learn to listen. And I'll also just add another caveat to this. The last project that I showed you, I've been working on it for 16 years. It's now reaching completion. Okay, in between, I've gone through 4 chief ministers. It started with our present prime minister. It was his dream. It has now moved on through subsequent things. The number of CEOs of the State Disaster Management Authority have, that's too many to count, that have changed. The people who work for them have changed, and the only constant are the people of Bhuj, which I have had very often had to have public meetings to explain to them, because the last set are not there any longer. So you say, okay, this is what we're... There was a rumor at some point that quarrying was going on the site, that we were taking away stones from there. All kinds of things happen. But I think if we decide that we need to do something, it will happen. And I don't think we should lose hope. See, all of these are things that can be addressed. So all the universities are 8 years, 7 years. It's not something that happens in... I'm on my third chancellor, second vice chancellor. So, yeah. You are the institutional memory. You have to keep it going. All of you are the institutional memory. And you can't forget that. It's your place.
Thank you.